Innocent man trapped in jail for 2 years with no lawyer. Judge's response stuns the courtroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor across the crowded courtroom. The air hung heavy with a peculiar mix of industrial cleaner sweat and desperation, a scent unique to the halls of justice, where hope often came to die. It was a Tuesday morning in the Riverside County Courthouse, and the gallery was filled with the usual cast of characters, weary public defenders shuffling through overflowing case files, prosecutors with coffee-stained ties, and families clinging to whatever fragments of optimism they could muster. In the corner of the holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, Stephen Adams sat motionless. His once fit frame had withered during his 732 days of pre-trial detention. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely on his shoulders, a stark contrast to the tailored suits he once wore as a construction project manager. At 38, the premature gray streak in his temples wasn't genetic. It was the physical manifestation of his ongoing nightmare. Docket number 47829, State versus Stephen Adams, called the clerk, her voice a practiced monotone that betrayed no recognition that this case was different from the dozens she'd announced that day. 2 years ago, Stephen had been arrested while leaving a convenience store that had been robbed just minutes earlier. The real perpetrator had fled, but Stephen, who happened to be wearing a blue jacket similar to the one described by witnesses, became the focus of police attention. What should have been a simple misunderstanding spiraled into a nightmare when an overzealous detective claimed to have found fingerprint evidence linking Stephen to the crime scene. The preliminary evidence had been enough for an indictment, but not once in 24 months had actual proof materialized. As Stephen was led to the defendant's table, his eyes scanned the room for his court-appointed attorney. This would be his third lawyer in 2 years. The first had left the public defender's office for private practice, and the second had been reassigned to another division after taking medical leave. Stephen had met his current attorney, James Wilson, exactly twice, once for 15 minutes after Wilson had been assigned the case 4 months ago, and once for a hurried 10-minute conversation last week. Judge John Stevens Jr. entered the courtroom, his reputation for no-nonsense efficiency preceding him. What no one expected was that today, that efficiency would finally work in Stephen Adams' favor. "Court is now in session," announced the bailiff as everyone rose. For Stephen Adams, this was just another in an endless parade of hearings that led nowhere. But today would be different. Today, the system that had failed him for 2 years would finally be forced to confront its own broken machinery. Judge Stevens glanced down at the file before him, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. He looked up at the prosecutor, then at the defense attorney, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Mr. Wilson," the judge addressed the public defender, "I'm looking at this case history, and I'm seeing a disturbing pattern. Mr. Adams has been in custody for," he paused to check the dates, "just over 2 years, and there's been minimal movement on this case. Can you explain why?" James Wilson shifted uncomfortably. At 31, he was handling a caseload of over 130 defendants, more than double the American Bar Association's recommended maximum. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, and dark circles rimmed his eyes. "Your Honor, the defense has been working diligently on Mr. Adams' case. However, there have been some challenges with—" "Challenges," Stephen interrupted, unable to contain himself any longer. Is that what you call it when I don't hear from my lawyer for months at a time, when every letter I send goes unanswered, when I'm sitting in jail for 2 years for something I didn't do? Mr. Adams, the judge cautioned, though his tone lacked its usual sternness, you'll have your opportunity to speak. Stephen's unexpected outburst had captured the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Among them was Rebecca Torres, an investigative journalist who had come to observe another case but found herself drawn to this unfolding drama. She quietly pulled out her notebook and began taking notes. Judge Stevens turned back to the public defender. Mr. Wilson, when was the last time you had a substantial meeting with your client? Wilson fumbled through his calendar. I met with Mr. Adams last week for a pre-hearing consultation. And before that, the judge pressed, I believe it was when I took over the case 4 months ago. The judge's expression darkened. 2 meetings in 4 months for a client who's been in pre-trial detention for 2 years. And what about the evidence the prosecution claimed to have? Where are we on that? District Attorney Sarah Mitchell rose. Her crisp suit and confident demeanor usually dominated the courtroom. But today, even she seemed discomfited. Your Honor, the state has been working to process the evidence. The crime lab has been backlogged, and for 2 years, Ms. Mitchell, Judge Stevens' voice took on an edge. Your office claimed to have fingerprint evidence linking Mr. Adams to the scene. Has this evidence been processed or not? The prosecutor hesitated. The preliminary results were inconclusive. Your Honor, we've requested additional testing. When did you request this additional testing? Mitchell checked her notes. 14 months ago. Your Honor, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Stevens raised his hand for silence. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, he said, his voice measured but filled with growing indignation. Mr. Adams has spent 2 years in jail. The only evidence against him is fingerprint evidence that after 14 months remains inconclusive. He's had 3 different public defenders, and his current counsel has met with him exactly twice in 4 months. No one spoke. The truth laid bare in the judge's summary was damning. Stephen Adams stood up, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. Your Honor, I've lost my job. I've lost my apartment. My mother died while I was in here, and I wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. All this for a crime I didn't commit. He turned to look at his attorney. And this man who's supposed to be fighting for me doesn't even know my case. I want to represent myself. I can't do any worse than what's been done for me so far. The courtroom fell silent. Even Rebecca Torres paused, her note-taking struck by the raw emotion in Stephen's voice. Judge Stevens studied Stephen for a long moment. Mr. Adams, representing yourself is rarely advisable. Even a flawed attorney has training that you don't. With all due respect, Your Honor, Stephen replied, I've had 2 years in the jail's law library to learn. I've filed motions that my attorneys ignored. I've written letters that went unanswered. The system has failed me at every turn, and I can't sit by anymore hoping someone else will fix it. In that moment, something shifted. In the courtroom, Stephen Adams was no longer just another defendant in an orange jumpsuit. He was a man fighting for his life with dignity and determination that commanded respect. Judge Stevens nodded slowly. I understand your frustration, Mr. Adams. Before we address your request to represent yourself, I want to get to the bottom of what's happened here. He turned to the bailiff. We're going to take a 30-minute recess. When we return, I want Ms. Mitchell to have concrete answers about this evidence and Mr. Wilson to have his complete case file present. As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, Rebecca Torres slipped out of the courtroom. She had a story to pursue, one that might finally shine a light on the broken promises of the justice system. When court reconvened, there was a palpable tension in the air. Judge Stevens had used the recess to review Stevens' file more thoroughly, and his expression was grim as he took the bench. Ms. Mitchell, what can you tell me about the status of the evidence against Mr. Adams? The prosecutor stood visibly less confident than before. Your Honor, after consulting with the crime lab, I must inform the court that the fingerprint evidence initially cited in this case was indeed processed 18 months ago. The results excluded Mr. Adams as a match. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, and why Judge Stevens asked, his voice dangerously quiet, was the defense not informed of this exculpatory evidence? There appears to have been an administrative oversight, Your Honor. The results were filed but not forwarded to the defense or noted in our case management system. Stephen stared in disbelief. 18 months of his life gone because of an administrative oversight. Judge Stevens turned to the public defender. Mr. Wilson, were you aware of this? No, Your Honor, Wilson admitted. This is the first I'm hearing of it. And if you had conducted a thorough review of the evidence and followed up with the crime lab, as is your duty as defense counsel, might you have discovered this sooner? Wilson had no response. The next morning, Rebecca Torres's article appeared in the front section of the Riverside Gazette. Justice delayed man spends 2 years in jail, while exonerating evidence collects dust. The story quickly gained traction on social media, prompting local TV stations to pick it up. By the third day, Stevens' case had attracted the attention of Innocence, now a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting wrongful convictions. Their lead attorney, Maya Rodriguez, appeared in Judge Stevens' courtroom. Your Honor, Innocence now requests permission to appear as counsel for Mr. Adams with his consent. Maya stated, her voice confident and clear. Stephen had been skeptical. When the organization first contacted him after 2 years of disappointment, trust didn't come easily. But Maya had spent hours with him the previous evening, listening to his story and explaining how they could help. Mr. Adams, is this your wish? Judge Stevens asked. Yes, Your Honor. Stephen replied, Ms. Rodriguez has already spent more time with me than all my previous attorneys combined. The judge nodded. Permission granted, Ms. Rodriguez. I assume you'll be filing motions regarding Mr. Adams' continued detention. Already prepared, Your Honor, Maya said, approaching the bench with documents in hand. Given the exculpatory evidence that was withheld, we're moving for immediate dismissal of all charges and release of Mr. Adams. District Attorney Mitchell objected, arguing that while the fingerprint evidence didn't implicate Stephen, there were still witness statements regarding the blue jacket, a blue jacket. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Stevens raised an eyebrow. You've kept a man in jail for 2 years over a blue jacket when your only forensic evidence exonerates him. The gallery murmured in disapproval. Furthermore, Maya added, we've located security camera footage from a gas station 2 blocks from the convenience store showing Mr. Adams there at the time of the robbery. This footage was never obtained by the police or previous defense counsel. This revelation sent another ripple through the courtroom. Judge Stevens called both attorneys to the bench for a sidebar conference that lasted several tense minutes. When they returned to their places, Judge Stevens addressed the court. In light of the evidence, or rather the lack thereof, against Mr. Adams, and the serious procedural failures, in this case, I am dismissing all charges against the defendant. Mr. Adams, you are to be released immediately." The gallery erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff. Stephen stood motionless, unable to process that his nightmare might finally be ending. Furthermore, the judge continued, "I am ordering a full investigation into the handling of this case by both the district attorney's office and the public defender's office. This court has witnessed a profound failure of justice, and there must be accountability." As Stephen was led out to process his release, Rebecca Torres approached Maya Rodriguez. "Ms. Rodriguez, Rebecca Torres from the Gazette. Can I get a statement from you and Mr. Adams once he's released?" Maya glanced at Stephen for his approval. He nodded, still dazed by the sudden turn of events. "We'll meet you outside in about an hour," Maya replied. "But understand that this isn't just about Stephen's case. This is about a systemic failure that's affecting countless others who don't have media attention or outside help. Stephen's first taste of freedom in 2 years was overwhelming. The sun seemed too bright, the sounds of traffic too loud, the choices too many. Maya had helped him secure temporary housing and connected him with resources for people wrongfully incarcerated. But adjusting to life outside was proving harder than he'd imagined. A week after his release, Stephen sat across from Rebecca Torres at a small coffee shop, his hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't lifted to his lips. "I should be happy," he said quietly. "I'm free, but I feel lost. My mom's gone, my apartment's gone, my job's gone, my savings are gone, 2 years of my life gone." Rebecca nodded, recording their conversation with Stephen's permission. "What's been the hardest part?" Stephen considered the question. "People look at me differently now. Even though I was innocent, the stigma of having been in jail follows me. Yesterday, I ran into my former neighbor. He crossed the street to avoid me." As Stephen's story gained wider attention, it began to expose deeper issues within the county's justice system. Other cases came to light, other defendants who had been lost in the system, their rights trampled under the weight of overcrowded dockets and overburdened attorneys. But as public interest grew, so did the pushback. District Attorney Mitchell held a press conference defending her office and suggesting that Stephen's case was an isolated incident. The Public Defender's Office issued a statement blaming chronic underfunding and impossible caseloads. Meanwhile, Stephen was struggling to rebuild his life. Despite his skills and experience, employers were reluctant to hire someone who had been in jail regardless of innocence. His credit was ruined. He was staying in a halfway house because no landlord would rent to him without income or credit. The crisis point came 1 month after his release, when Stephen received a letter from the county. It was a bill for his stay in the county jail, a policy that charged former inmates for their incarceration costs. If they were financially able to pay, they want me to pay $32,850 for being wrongfully imprisoned. Stephen told Maya, his voice shaking with rage and disbelief, "How is this even legal?" Maya was equally outraged. "It's not just legal, it's common practice in many jurisdictions. But given the circumstances of your case, this is particularly egregious." That same day, a clerk from Judge Stephen's court called Maya. The judge wanted to see her and Stephen immediately. When they arrived at the courthouse, Stephen felt his chest tighten. The last time he'd walked through these doors, he'd been in shackles, expecting just another meaningless hearing. Now, He was returning as a free man, yet the building still held power over him. Judge Stevens was waiting in his chambers rather than the courtroom, an unusual move that signaled the unofficial nature of this meeting. Mr. Adams, Ms. Rodriguez. He greeted them, rising from behind his desk. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." The judge gestured for them to sit. "I've been following the aftermath of your case, Mr. Adams, and I must say I'm deeply troubled by what I'm seeing. The system failed you in custody, and it appears to be failing you again in freedom." Stephen placed the county's bill on the judge's desk. "They want me to pay for my wrongful incarceration, Your Honor." Judge Stevens picked up the document, his expression darkening as he read it. "This is," he struggled to find words, "unconscionable." He set the bill down and leaned forward. "I've been on the bench for 17 years, and I have always believed in the fundamental fairness of our system, despite its flaws. Your case has forced me to reconsider that belief." The judge moved to his window, looking out at the city below. "The investigation I ordered has uncovered disturbing patterns, dozens of cases, mishandled evidence, not shared defendants waiting months or years for trials." He turned back to face them. "And now, this bill adding financial injury to the injustice you've already endured." Stephen felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since his release. Someone with authority was acknowledging the wrong done to him. "What happens now, Your Honor?" he asked. "That depends partly on you, Mr. Adams." Judge Stevens replied, "I can quash this bill with a court order. That's the easy part. But addressing the larger issues that led to your situation, that will require more, much more." Maya leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Judge?" "I'm suggesting," he said slowly, "that sometimes justice requires more than working within the system. Sometimes it requires challenging the system itself." With those words, Judge Stevens set in motion a chain of events that would transform Stephen's personal tragedy into a catalyst for change, and place all three of them on a collision course with powerful interests determined to maintain the status quo. In the weeks that followed, Stephen found himself at the center of a growing movement. Judge Stevens had not only quashed the bill for his incarceration, but had also issued a rare judicial opinion condemning the practice of charging wrongfully imprisoned individuals for their stay in jail. Meanwhile, Maya and the team at Innocence now helped Stephen file a civil rights lawsuit against the county, the district attorney's office, and the public defender's office. The suit sought not only damages for Stephen, but systemic changes to prevent similar injustices. Rebecca Torres continued to cover the story, her articles sparking a public conversation about a justice system that had become so focused on processing cases that it had forgotten its purpose, justice itself. As public attention grew, so did resistance from those invested in the status quo. District Attorney Mitchell publicly accused Judge Stevens of judicial activism and overreach. The county government warned that any significant settlement or system changes would necessitate budget cuts to essential services. "They're trying to make me the villain," Stephen told Maya as they prepared for a community forum on pretrial detention. "They want people to think that helping me means hurting them." "It's a classic tactic," Maya replied. "Divide potential allies by making justice seem like a zero-sum game." Stephen had grown in confidence over the past weeks. The shy, broken man who had emerged from jail was finding his voice and his purpose. He had started speaking at community events, sharing his story, and connecting with others who had faced similar injustices. Through these connections, Stephen and Maya discovered a pattern more disturbing than they had initially realized. In their county, defendants represented by public defenders were 6 times more likely to accept plea deals even when innocent than those with private attorneys. The average public defender had less than 2 hours to devote to each case, while carrying caseloads 3 times the recommended maximum. Judge Stevens, meanwhile, had begun reviewing old cases looking for others who might have been lost in the system. Like Stephen, he found dozens, many still in pretrial detention for years, their cases seemingly forgotten. The judge's actions drew attention from the state's Judicial Council, which expressed concerns about his recent decisions. The message was clear: back off or face consequences. But Judge Stevens had reached a point in his career where professional consequences mattered less than doing what was right. At 64, with retirement on the horizon, he was more concerned with his legacy than his career. 3 months after Stevens' release, the stage was set for a public hearing that would determine whether his civil rights case could proceed as a class action, potentially affecting hundreds of similarly situated defendants and forcing sweeping reforms. The night before the hearing, Stephen paced his new apartment, a modest 1-bedroom he had finally secured after finding work as a construction safety consultant. The walls were still bare, the furniture minimal. But it was his, a symbol of the life he was rebuilding. His phone rang. "Maya, Stephen, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "The county has offered to settle your individual case. $5 million confidential terms, no admission of wrongdoing, and no systemic changes." Stephen sat down heavily. $5 million. It was a fortune to someone who just months ago had nothing. It could secure his future, perhaps even his children's future, if he ever had any. "What about everyone else?" he asked already, knowing the answer. "The offer is just for you. They want this to go away quietly." Stephen closed his eyes, remembering the faces of men he'd met in jail, men still waiting for their day in court, men who might be innocent but lacked the resources or luck to prove it. "No," he said finally, "I didn't go through all this just for money. I want change." Maya was silent for a moment. "I thought you'd say that, but I had to present the offer." "I know what happens now." "Now," Maya said, determination evident in her voice, "we go to court and we make history." The courthouse was packed the next morning. News cameras lined the steps, and supporters held signs reading, "Justice for Stephen, justice for all, and no more forgotten defendants." Inside the gallery was filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls. District Attorney Mitchell had brought reinforcements. The State Attorney General's office had sent a deputy to argue against the class certification, arguing that Stephen's case was unique and not representative of systemic issues. Judge Martin Reeves, assigned to hear the civil case, was known as a conservative jurist who rarely ruled against government entities. The odds seemed stacked against Stephen and Maya. As the hearing began, Maya presented a compelling case for class certification, documenting dozens of similar cases and arguing that individual lawsuits could never address the fundamental problems in the system. The Deputy Attorney General countered that these were isolated incidents reflecting individual mistakes, not systemic failures. She argued that allowing the case to proceed as a class action would cripple the justice system, with unwarranted oversight and unreasonable costs. When it was Stephen's turn to speak, He approached the podium slowly, conscious of all eyes upon him. The courtroom fell silent. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady. "Despite his racing heart, 2 years of my life were stolen from me, not by a criminal, but by the very system meant to protect justice. I lost my mother during that time. I'll never get to say goodbye to her. I lost my home, my job, my dignity." He paused, looking around the courtroom. "But I'm not here today because of what I lost. I'm here because every day in this courthouse and others like it across the country, there are people losing just as much or more people without voices, without advocates, without hope." Stephen gestured to the gallery, where former inmates and families of current detainees sat. "These people aren't asking for millions in damages. They're asking for something much more basic, the right to a fair process, the right to an attorney who has time to actually read their case file, the right to see evidence that might prove their innocence, the right to have their day in court before years of their lives slip away." The courtroom was utterly silent now, every person hanging on Stephen's words, "Your Honor, the county has offered me money to go away quietly. A lot of money. They want me to think only of myself, to take what I can get and forget about everyone else still trapped in the system." He leaned forward, gripping the podium. "But I can't do that, because this isn't just about me. It's about whether we truly believe in equal justice under law, or whether that's just a phrase we carve on courthouse walls while ignoring it in courthouse cells." Judge Reeves, who had been taking notes throughout, set down his pen and studied Stephen. "Mr. Adams, the law doesn't always align with what feels morally right. As a judge, I'm bound by precedent and statute, not by what I personally believe justice should look like." Stephen nodded. "I understand that, Your Honor. For 2 years, I watched the law work perfectly according to its procedures while producing a profoundly unjust result. I'm not asking you to ignore the law. I'm asking you to use it as it was intended, to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, to ensure that rights exist not just on paper, but in practice." The judge leaned back, considering. Then, to everyone's surprise, he addressed the crowded courtroom. "I've heard many arguments in this courtroom over the years, skilled attorneys citing case law and precedent, constitutional scholars debating fine points of legal theory." He turned his gaze to Stephen. "But rarely have I heard anyone speak more directly to the purpose of law itself." A murmur ran through the gallery. "Court will recess for 1 hour while I consider the arguments presented," Judge Reeves announced. That hour felt like an eternity to Stephen. He sat with Maya, neither speaking much, both preparing for either outcome. When court reconvened, Judge Reeves delivered his ruling with little preamble. After careful consideration of the evidence presented and the arguments of counsel, this court finds that the plaintiff has satisfied the requirements for class certification. The systemic issues identified affect a clearly definable class of individuals in substantially similar ways. Maya gripped Stephen's arm in excitement as the judge continued. "Furthermore, this court finds that the interests of justice require expedited discovery in this matter. The defendants are ordered to produce all relevant records within 30 days. The gallery erupted in applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff. "This is just the beginning," Maya whispered to Stephen, "but it's a very good beginning." As they left the courthouse, they found Judge Stevens waiting on the steps out of his robes, just a citizen showing support. "You did it," He said simply, extending his hand to Stephen, "We did it." Stephen corrected him, taking the offered hand. "All of us." Rebecca Torres pushed through the crowd, recorder in hand. "Stephen, what does this ruling mean to you?" Stephen looked at the gathered crowd, supporters, media, curious onlookers. He thought about how far he had come from that desperate man in an orange jumpsuit, forgotten by the system, meant to ensure justice. "It means," he said, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps, "that being forgotten is no longer an option. It means that the system will have to see us, all of us, as people, not just case numbers. It means that maybe, just maybe, justice for all might finally start to mean something real." 1 year after the class action certification, Stephen stood at a podium in the state capitol, watching as the governor signed the Stephen Adams Justice Reform Act into law. The legislation mandated maximum caseloads for public defenders, required prompt disclosure of all evidence to defense counsel, imposed strict limits on pretrial detention without formal charges, and established an independent oversight commission to monitor compliance. Rebecca Torres, now an award-winning journalist for her coverage of the case, stood nearby, recording the historic moment. "This law won't solve everything," the governor acknowledged, "but it represents a crucial step toward ensuring that what happened to Stephen Adams never happens to anyone else in our state." Stephen had become the face of a movement larger than himself. His civil case had resulted not only in substantial damages for him and others like him, but more importantly, in court-mandated reforms that were already showing results. In the years since the lawsuit began, pretrial detention rates had dropped by 40%, and cases were moving through the system more efficiently. District Attorney Mitchell had resigned 6 months earlier, following an investigation that revealed patterns of evidence suppression in multiple cases. James Wilson, Stephen's former public defender, had testified before the state legislature about the impossible conditions under which public defenders worked testimony that proved crucial in securing support for the new law Judge Stevens, despite pressure from colleagues and a formal reprimand from the Judicial Council for his unconventional methods, had continued to advocate for reform from the bench. His bold stance had inspired other judges to examine their own roles in perpetuating systemic injustice. After the ceremony, Stephen found himself surrounded by cameras and microphones. "How does it feel to see a law bearing your name?" one reporter asked. Stephen considered the question carefully. "Honestly, it feels strange. I never wanted to be famous, especially not for spending 2 years in jail for something I didn't do. But if my experience can help others, then maybe those 2 years weren't completely wasted." Another reporter called out, "What's next for you, Stephen?" It was a question he'd been asking himself. In the past year, he had been offered book deals and speaking engagements. He'd been approached about movie rights to his story. He'd even been encouraged to run for office. "Next for me is helping to implement this law." Stephen replied, "Innocence now has offered me a position as an advocate for pretrial detainees. I'll be working with people who are where I was lost in the system, fighting to be heard." Maya Rodriguez joined him at the podium. "Stephen won't be working alone. Innocence Now is establishing offices in 5 additional counties, and we've secured funding for a hotline that family members can call if they believe their loved ones have been unjustly detained or are not receiving adequate representation." That evening, Stephen drove to the cemetery where his mother was buried. He hadn't been able to attend her funeral, a pain that still cut deep. He placed flowers on her grave and sat on the grass beside it. "We did it, Mom," he said softly. "You always taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets. I hope I've made you proud." As he drove home to his new apartment, a comfortable 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, Stephen reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. 2 years of his life had been stolen by a broken system. Nothing could ever give him back that time or the moments lost with his mother. But in fighting for himself, he had found a way to fight for others. In seeking justice for his own case, he had helped create a path to justice for thousands more. The system wasn't fixed, far from it, but it had been forced to acknowledge its failings and take the first steps toward meaningful change. That night, Stephen received an email from a woman he'd never met. Her brother had been in pre-trial detention for 14 months, unable to afford bail, separated from his children thanks to the new law and the work of innocence. Now, he was being released tomorrow. Pending trial. "You don't know us," the email read, "but you've given our family hope when we had none. Thank you for not taking the money and walking away. Thank you for remembering that behind every case number is a human being. Thank you for showing us that one person can make a difference." Stephen read the email twice, then saved it to a folder where he kept similar messages, reminders of why the fight mattered, why his 2 lost years might ultimately serve a greater purpose than he could have imagined. Tomorrow, he would visit the jail where he had spent those 2 years, this time as an advocate rather than an inmate. He would meet with men and women still trapped in the system, offering them what he had so desperately needed during his own ordeal: a voice, a listener, a fighter on their side. The system that had failed him was slowly being rebuilt, and Stephen Adams, once its victim, was now helping to lay the foundation for something better, a justice system worthy of its name. As he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of something Judge Stevens had told him during their first unofficial meeting. Sometimes justice requires more than working within the system. Sometimes it requires challenging the system itself. Stephen had done exactly that, and while the cost had been enormous, the reward, not just for him, but for countless others, was beginning to prove worth the fight. "Justice for all," he murmured as sleep claimed him. Not just words on a courthouse wall anymore, but a promise he would spend the rest of his life working to fulfill.